Good morning, everybody. As you're all getting situated and set up, and as people continue to join us here, my name is Eric Schwartz. I am co-founder of the Center for Free Enterprise, along with Ben Calkins, also managing director at the Center for Free Enterprise for Cleveland Private Trust. Today we will have our panel. John Lane will be leading that panel. I'll introduce all of them here in a moment. We will then, as we normally do, allow you to ask questions in the chat box, and I will introduce those questions during the conversation. And then at the end of it, around 10 o'clock, we will have our networking time that everyone seems to enjoy, where I'll break you all into rooms of 5 or so where we can talk for another 45 minutes or so and get to do some socializing. So next month, for June, I will be having a discussion and interviewing Tom Zucker from EdgePoint Capital. He'll be talking about building a business, running a business during COVID, talking about what he's seen in the M&A markets, and talking about what he's seen in the economy. He's got some interesting perspectives. If you don't know him, he's a great guy. It should be a great conversation. And that'll be the third Friday in June. Look for the invite and the information about that. So let me introduce who we're talking with today. Today we're talking about selling privately held businesses, or buying one, and what the factors are that we should be considering in those transactions. The panel moderator today is John Lane, who is the CEO and Managing Director of Inglewood & Associates, which is a Great Lakes regional business firm. John's had 45 years of broad financial management, operational, technical, international experience with middle market and entrepreneurial companies, and he is an all-around great guy. Mike Trabert, my friend, is with New Markham. He is the partner and the leader of the Value Acceleration and Exit Planning Service Group there at the firm. He and I also led the Exit Planning Institute for quite some time. I always enjoy listening to Mike talk. Also is Wayne Foley, who is the president and CEO of Kintronics, which is a manufacturer of precision servo controlled actuators. He's joined us today from a family's residence in Chicago, so we're glad to have him. Welcome, Wayne. And then last but not least is Brian Jeckering. Brian is the CEO of Polychem. He has been there for some time and has had some recent transactions that I look forward to hearing him talk about. Also just want to remind you too, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box and I will introduce them at an appropriate time during the conversation. And so I guess, I'd also like to thank our sponsors while I'm doing this. I have to do that as well. I'd like to thank JP Morgan Private Bank, the Calkins Law Firm and Ben Calkins, Cleveland Private Trust Company, Lightkowski and Company, Dave Lightkowski, and Creative Gold Media, who does all of our media and improves all the videos that we put up on our website. I want to thank all those folks for making this happen. So I guess I got all the business out of the way. So I will now turn it over to John. John, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Eric. I want to kick off this meeting about a story that I had with two very tired business owners. They'd owned the business for decades, but in recent years, the profits started to decline. So as many business owners started to do, they started cutting costs. What they started cutting the costs, though, they reduced the sales force, they eliminated marketing, and they greatly deferred CapEx, which certainly distressed the business. The reason why they did this was because they were trying to maintain their payouts. They wanted to make sure they kept on pulling the same amount out of the money out of the company. And in exchange, they felt, well, we don't need sales and marketing and that sort of thing. I met with them, and the company certainly, again, was in a distressed state. I asked them how much do they think this was worth, and they threw out a number which was insanely distressed state of the business. I asked them, how did you come up with this number? And their response was, well, that's how much money we need to retire on. So the bottom line is, your business is worth what it's worth. It's not worth what you need. This presentation, however, hopefully will give you some tips, ideas, whatever, with respect to how to enhance your business's value when selling, so maybe closer to what you want. So and I'm going to put a mind map up in a moment. The key takeaways here is that there is no single value for it. The same business being sold by the same person, ultimately bought by the same buyer, could have a wide range of value depending on how the sales process was carried out. Something as simple as, did the potential buyer call the company first, or did the company call the potential buyer first, could have an impact on value to some degree. Eric, okay, you've got me for shared screen, I think.
Yep, we're good. Thank you, sir.
Excellent. It's amazing what an old guy can do if you teach him enough. So again, these are this document will be sent around to everyone after the presentation. As you can see, there's many ways that you can impact the business. So and we're going to cover as much as we can, but certainly, if you have questions on certain, please do. Our group has been I think. So we're going to go to the first section, which is ownership, company impact. And Brian is going to cover this.
Okay. My name is Brian Jackring. I'll just give you a brief intro on my transaction experience. I worked with a small group of private investors called Orion and Cornerstone, where we did, while I was there, we did 2 transactions. I supported the first and then led the second. And due to our size, we did everything from sourcing, prospecting, all the way through to presenting, creating the transaction, structuring it, presenting it to the seller, and then actually managing the whole legal negotiation of the final detailed documents all the way through to closing. After that, I joined Polychem. There are kind of 2 phases to my experience there. As you know, I was there over 20 years, and the management team and I transformed that business from a consumables only business to a full services service provider for systems in the packaging industry. We did a series of 9 proprietary transactions to accomplish that. And we didn't really have a corporate development role, so that really fell into my lap. Beginning of 2018, this is the second phase for Polychem, we began a strategic process where we sold the business, and we evaluated strategic opportunities, but it led to the sale of the business. We ultimately were successful selling it to the Sterling Group in March of 2019. They're one of the oldest PE groups in the country, and they're headquartered out of Texas. That previous transaction experience helped, but the perspective switched. I now needed to always put myself in the buyer's shoes, where I had been the buyer in the past. And also my previous experience doing transactions had always been on a proprietary deal. So now we're involved in an investment banking led transaction, different scale. All the elements of the transaction were still there, but they're amplified. And the process was a lot more involved, a lot more structured. I continued on as CEO until they identified a successor around December 2019. And since then, I've stayed on the board, both on the domestic company and for some of their international investments. And I'm currently retained as an advisor on operations and M&A activities. And we've done, before I left as CEO, we did 1 transaction of a competitor, and since have done 3 more. And I support them, doing in management presentations, input on confidential information memorandums and internal documents, structures, sourced opportunities, led a due diligence effort and supported due diligence efforts, and have done a little bit of presented and negotiated the transaction with certain sellers. So when I get back to the mind map, one of the first issues that we're asked to discuss was the ownership. And the thing that I want to talk about first is the reasons for selling. It has to be compelling. Throughout this process, you'll be challenged on a lot of different issues. You want to make sure that the reason that you're doing this makes sense to everyone that's involved and makes sense to you. One of the first questions I asked when I was pursuing a transaction was, are they really sellers? And I think anybody that's going to devote the time and money to acquire a business is going to have the same question. Are they tire kickers, or are they really selling? So you want to make sure that story is there and that it makes sense. It's true. So for Polychem's case, we had always pursued growth, and we really needed to continue to do that. But our shareholders had kind of our primary shareholders had entered a different stage in their life where they were a little bit more risk averse and transitioned to other kind of concerns around estate planning, capital accumulation. So if we wanted to continue to grow, we needed to transition into a different partner. And due to our success, our leverage, and a couple other factors, a management buyout wasn't really likely. And even if we did pursue that, we would have had to utilize an investment bank or some other outside party. So, we did end up pursuing a strategic process. So again, make sure that the reasons make sense. For us, we had aging investors. We were dedicated as a cultural element of the business. We were dedicated to growth. We needed to continue that culture. So we had to have the right partners, and we were successful. So there was no time crunch there. We could pursue this process appropriately. You just want to make sure that you pick the right time. So we were able to do that. One of the next things that I think I would like to touch on is the shareholder alignment. Our board, our shareholders, and I had been discussing what the next phase would be for many years. So by the time we finally decided that we needed to pursue a strategic process, we were all pretty well aligned. The shareholders are definitely aligned, the board as well. And you want to make sure that your board, and especially your chairman, whoever's leading the process from the board perspective, is behind this 100%. You want to make sure you're pulling all in the same direction. And in our case, we actually, in order to do this successfully, we had to make additional investments. We employed several consultants to do a market study. We were kind of a niche industry, so we wanted people to understand that. We did a quality of earnings study and a phase 1 environmental study up front. And that all these things were, they weren't inconsequential from a cost standpoint, but they're also designed to answer kind of obvious questions. So instead of having to receive the questions and then respond, we were trying to get out ahead of the obvious questions that we knew that were going to come up in the process. So the board commitment is really crucial. The management team, as a CEO, I had been thinking through a lot of the different issues. It was a family business, so there were some mixed feelings about it, but I also looked at all the different possibilities, and I really didn't see another alternative. So ultimately, I was 100% behind this process. You want to bring in the core management team as early as possible. That's something probably I could have done better, is showcase the management team, because to the extent that the owner or the CEO is really the business, that'll cause you some problems as you go to exit, because they know that they're going to have to replace an awful lot of the folks. The management team is a really valuable asset to the business, but it's not necessarily on the balance sheet. So you need to make sure that you do some things to showcase some of the unusual things that you've done as a company. Like, for instance, we did ERP implementation. We acquired companies and done integrations. We'd actually done a couple of startups. So you want to make sure that your management team gets a chance to talk about those things rather than the CEO or the owner, just to give them more. They're probably hearing it from them provides a little bit more credibility. And it's also shows what the capability of the business is. When we went through,
I would expect also, Brian, I'd also expect that the last thing that the buyer wants to hear is the broker or the investment banker doing the presentation. They want to hear from the management team as a whole.
Exactly. That's definitely the case. In our case, the whole management team led all the presentations. The investment banker was the moderator maybe, but tried to keep things on track. But it was really the management team that did the whole presentation. The process is pretty grueling. So you want to make sure that we took a different, I don't know if it was the right approach, but the CFO and I took on most of the bulk of the interaction with the investment bank during the process so that the management team could run the business day to day. I probably could have brought them in more in the process. I think it would have educated them on the process a little bit better. But it's kind of a trade-off, you got to run the business day to day, not let it get derailed by this process. So you got to kind of make that call yourself about how much you pull them into the investment banking process and how much you shield them from it so that the business can run day to day. I probably could have pulled them in more, but you got to make that choice based on the skill set that you have. The last part is the employees. They're an important stakeholder. The only thing that travels faster in a business than the truth is a rumor. So, you want to get out ahead of that as much as possible. And what we did was before it was public that the company, and it's as much as you try to keep these things private, it's going to, as you start to tell more and more, pursue more and more sellers, it's going to get out into the marketplace. You want to make sure that you talk to the employees. I held over a dozen meetings so that I could meet with everybody from the production floor all the way through to the management team to make sure that we told them the reasons why. And that's part of that, going back to is the reason compelling? It has to make sense to the folks on the production floor, and it has to make sense to the people that are potential investors. So I met with everybody to make sure that they were on board, because when you're getting ready to do plant walkthroughs and things like that, you need to have their support. You need to get, put the best face forward, and the employees are a part of that. We also did some things around retention bonuses and management incentives for people that were helping with the presentations, helping with the whole sale process. Those typically, all of ours were paid out post-closing, post-success, by 3 to 4 months. But it was a way to reward the people for the effort that they put in. We tried to include all the change agents in the business in this process as much, in these incentives as much as possible. So it touched a lot of different folks.
Hey, Brian, I presume that one thing you do not want to demonstrate is that you have a great urgency for a sale. I would presume that would work against you. Right.
You're right. And you want to pick a time, if you can, where you've got that time, you got the luxury of time. I'll touch on that in kind of a story that I'll tell you about to kind of wrap up. But yeah, you want to make sure that time's your friend. So ideally, when you're going to sell, you want to be in that stage of growth where there's a lot of runway ahead, where you've got potential to continue to grow. That's kind of the ideal situation, but businesses are complex. For us, we had 3 divisions, and the story was slightly different for each. One had a nice growth path. One was a little bit more tepid, and then the other one, there were some challenges associated with it. So you have to be prepared to explain what your situation is, but above all else, you need to be truthful about it. You want to make sure that you've got, if you're everybody wants to have this growth path, but if it's pure marketing, it's wishful forecasts, it's not going to wear well. And ultimately, if it's not believable, it reflects more on the management team and the owner than it does, and the business more than it does on the investment bank. So you want to make sure that whatever you're putting out in front of folks, it's going to be a detailed process. You want to make sure that it's all truthful, it all hangs together.
Brian, I think I recall that you actually did a market study to show the growth going forward. To add support to what we're telling them regarding the future growth.
Yeah, that for us, it was not only we were a little bit of a niche industry, so some people would not necessarily understand the industry we were in. That helped us, explain where we really were in securement packaging, who our competitors were. And it also showed we focused more on the industry growth than necessarily, it was more based on our positioning in the industry, but it showed that there was good industry growth, so that helps support our claims of future growth. And it was good because it was an outside person doing this work. So it was a more objective presentation rather than purely from the management team. It was a little bit more objective. So the one thing, and this goes back.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh, you're welcome. One last thing is, I'll wrap this up real quickly, is that time issue. We had one individual on the board, and rightfully so, they said, hey, if this doesn't turn out right, we need to be able to say no and walk away. And that ultimately, that's your power. But the one thing that as the management and the leader of the project, I took that a little bit differently. I took that as you needed to make sure that you took this as seriously as possible, treated it as a one-time shot, and that you wanted to make sure that you got as many different options as possible. So you did everything possible to make sure that you maximize your choices at the end of the process, so that at the end, no is an option, but you wanted to make sure that the options that you were provided with gave you the ability to say yes. So you want to make sure that there's a commitment in this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Mike, you're up as I turn the page to talk about preparedness for the sale.
Thank you, and Brian, thank you. And I see a lot of names that I recognize out in the audience. So welcome to you, and welcome to the people I don't know as well. And John, I love your story as you introed, because I had this very conversation just yesterday, and your story was about how much is a business worth, Mr. Business Owner? And it's worth X amount. Well, how did you get that number? Well, that's the amount of money I need. Exact conversation. Yesterday, I got a call from an attorney to potentially help him in selling one of his clients' businesses. And when I asked what the business was worth, that was the response that he had received from the business owner. It's X amount because that's how much money I need. Has no relevance to it. We'll talk a little about valuation of the business in a moment. As Brian did, just give you a touch of background. So as Eric said, I'm a partner with Markham. This is our fourth business life. And in our fourth life, we merged with Markham about a year and a half ago. So we are now the 15th largest CPA firm, advisory firm in the country. And our second life, and unique, I guess, to this presentation and panel today, is that in our second business life, we acquired 130 companies in a 2-year period. So we went from one office and about 60 employees to having offices in 40 states, 240 locations, and 5,500 employees. And we looked at or talked to or did some form of due diligence on about 2,000 companies in that 2-year period. So what is preparedness? That's a topic that I'm tasked with today. So what is preparedness? Well, it's really about being ready to exit your business. And so it is a state of fact and not a state of mind. So it's not the owner waking up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to sell my business. So it's not the decision to sell. And it's really two considerations. Is the business ready to transition? And is the owner ready to transition? And so as we look at the mind map there and talk about preparedness, I think a lot of business owners are great at talking about their business and explaining the company. And I think a crucial part of this, and Brian alluded to this, is the strategy going forward for the business, because a buyer doesn't want to buy the business necessarily for the current income, but they want to accelerate that income. And how do I get there? And so what's the strategy to get me there? You talk about the quality of earnings, Q of E. And so more and more CPAs are getting asked to do quality of earnings from the sell side perspective. When years ago, it was mostly we'd be brought in to do a Q of E for the buyer, a potential buyer. But in this case, when you bring in somebody that's wearing the same uniform as you, and you could point out, and all business has some warts, and so you could point out the warts of the business in a friendly environment before the buyer discovers these sort of things. So as we talk about proactive and reactive, and again, one of the things that Brian said was anticipate what questions you're going to have. And a lot of those questions come up in a quality of earnings. So when we talk about being prepared and getting the data room ready, and so as we talk about the value acceleration process, there's really 3 phases to that. There's the discover phase, which is evaluation and assessment of the business. What's the strengths and weaknesses of the business, and then the action plan going forward. Then once you get to that next stage, the prepare stage, one of the things you do in there after you de-risk the business, because you really need to de-risk the business before you begin to build value in the business. But as you get a little further out, and we call it in the value acceleration methodology, assembling proof. And so if you're assembling proof as you go, it's certainly a lot easier to assemble that proof other than when you get to the stage that you believe you're ready to sell and you're pulling the information together. And timing's important, as was mentioned. And if you're assembling as you go, you have the information ready. And the buyer expectation is that the data will be available. And so, and as you're assembling that proof and getting the data room ready, you're seeing what you don't have, and then you can pull that information together and look like a more ready seller.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Question.
Yes.
Why not just why prepare? So what's the downside of calling up a couple people and say, I'm interested in selling, but you don't have the data ready? What happens?
Thanks for the question, John. One thing that does it delays the process, and it gives an opportunity for the buyers to look for other transactions. And also it puts somewhat of a negative stigma on the company, because the company is expected to have this information, and they likely do have the information, but they don't have it all compiled together in a nice, neat data room. So we talk about the cleanliness in a financial statement. So what's that really mean? And so how much noise is in your financial statement? So and we've heard rumors that some business owners run personal expenses through their business. And so the less of that, the better, the less noise in the financial statement. And that really gets into the next bullet then. And the more you prepare then, John, the more you can eliminate what otherwise might be add backs to the business. So we were brought in a couple of years ago to do a sell side quality of earnings for a company. And there was about 26 or so add backs to income. Well, that scares a buyer off when there's that many. What's typical? Don't know what typical is. Certainly less than 10, maybe 5 or so. So the expenses that run through the business should largely be business expenses. But as you're more prepared, you have an opportunity to eliminate some of those add backs to the business. Because one of the things that the buyer is obviously going to do, in addition to the seller generally conducting a quality of earnings, the buyer is going to do their own quality of earnings as well. Now, they do have a starting point if the seller would give them the Q of E of that their professionals have provided. And so the cut down on those questions would be better in the eyes of the seller and better in the eyes of the buyer. You talk about what type of financial statements, and most there's three types: highest level of service, an audit, and a review, and then a compilation is your kind of basic level of service, which by definition is just the company prepared numbers put on a piece of paper and kind of stamped by the CPA. In reality, it's not really not that, because CPAs are generally making journal entries to those numbers, but it adds an element of credibility to the financial statements if they're audited or reviewed in lieu of just compiled. Now, in part, the Q of E eliminates part of that, but I think there's still a credibility issue, and you're receiving more credibility for an audit. Brian, you mentioned this as we talk about budgets and projections, and the note I had there, and you hit it, you stole my thunder there, is they have to be realistic, because if, okay, you're maintaining marginal growth, okay, over the last few years, and all of a sudden you see this hockey stick growth. Well, how do I achieve this hockey stick growth? And it goes back to kind of the second bullet there when we talk about the company niche. And again, business owners are very good about explaining their business, but not as good about explaining the strategy that maybe not only got them there, but the strategy going forward. Cash flow.
And a question on the budgets. I mean, they're not all budgets are the same, I presume. I've seen budgets where they take last year's results and they just add 5%, from revenue down to expenses. And then I've seen other budgets where you look at the the revenue number, and then there's a tab that shows customer A, B, C, D, and what the expected growth is for each customer. I presume that has a bit of an impact depending which one you present.
Absolutely, John, and great point. And the more detail you have behind your budget. So if you go the 5% route, that's pretty easy math, but what's behind that? And so the customer, to start with your revenue, as you mentioned then, John, what's the detail behind the revenue number? So how much revenue might a top 10 customers each done in the last 3 years? How much are they expected to do the next year or two? And there's got to be really some meat on the bone to those numbers. Again, we shouldn't see, unless it's warranted, hockey stick growth. And then similarly with the expenses, things change obviously. And so the expenses are what they are projected to be, and not just historical numbers based on a 5% or so increase. Cybersecurity, much more important in this day and age. And then considering environmental issues, and Brian mentioned that he had an environmental study done for his business prior to selling. We're often asked, in what's the right time to transition? And part of what I do, I facilitate a program that we call the Owners Roundtable. We've done this 19 times now for business owners. We talk about what we call the 5 stages of value maturity. So taking them through the business. And we ask the owners the question, when's the right time to transition? And we show 3 graphs on the board. One is the age of the owner, which obviously is going up. And so their motivation is probably going down a little bit. Then we have a chart for the business life cycle. So the business grows a bit, then it maybe flattens, and it maybe starts to decline a bit. And then we have the private capital markets, and that would fluctuate. And so the owners look at the 3 graphs, and they give their answers of when's the ideal time to tell. And it's somewhat of a trick question, because there really is no right time to transition. You can't pick that magical time that, yeah, I'm going to sell now. So at a high level, macro level, then all baby boomers will be age 60 in 5 years. Why is that significant? It's significant because baby boomers own about 2/3 of the privately held businesses in the country. And surveys indicate that approximately half of the businesses will sell in the next 5 years, and about 3/4 of the businesses will sell in the next 10 years. So as we all know, it's an extreme seller's market right now. There's a ton of buyers, but that pendulum's going to swing then. And so only the good and great companies are going to have the opportunities to sell, and the multiples are likely to fall. So you want to make sure that your business is prepared. And in closing then, give you maybe a top 10 list, if you will, of are you ready to exit your business? So things to think about. Are you getting educated on the process? And so for you business owners that are out there and advisors as well, this panel here is part of that education. Are your personal, your financial, and your business goals, are they aligned? 3, have you created an advisory team? So if you've built that team around you, because it's not just going to be you. And I think as Brian said, a little differently, but you're going to have 2 jobs now as management of the business, running the day-to-day of the business and preparing the company for transition. A contingency plan, is there one available? 5, has the business been valued recently? And John told the story, and I reiterated that. So has the business been valued recently? And most owners, I don't think, have a great idea of value. Where did they get the number in their head? Well, 19th hole on the golf course, maybe. And also being prepared in the valuation in conjunction with an assessment of the business. So what's your strengths of the business? What's the weaknesses? Tool we use is 150 questions. And one of my owners, and he now has a $100 million company, once we got done with the 2-3 hour interview, he said, Mike, this is not just a cerebral exercise. This is the essence of running a business. As we drill down quite a bit, as we talk about a whole bunch of other things. Have you considered all your exit options? And we talk about 7 different exit options and the pros and cons of each. That's one of the sections in the Owners Roundtable. It's a day-long program that I facilitate. Is your transition plan written? And you have goals and objectives. So what do you want to accomplish? Only 7% of owners have a life after plan, like after they sell the business, that's written. So you can only rearrange the cupboard so many times after you sell the business. So you should figure out what you're going to do, whether it be charitable, consulting, buy another business, etc. Also, have you undertaken a pre-transition value enhancement program to increase the value of the business? Have you assembled that proof? Have you de-risked the business to maximize value, minimize taxes? And then lastly, is the leadership poised post-transition to operate the company? And Brian mentions one of the critical things is the management team, and probably outside of the business owner itself. And one of the things we say, if the owner is the business, there is no business. So it's a management team that's built out around that owner ready to transition. With that, I will pass the baton.
Thank you. Well, now I'm up. I've just changed the slides. Everyone knows that the old historical, financial buyer, strategic buyer. I think the lines of these have become blurred quite a bit. Private equity firms, there's so much money out there that the pricing from the private equity firms have gone up. Other questions, is going to be whether or not the private equity firm is looking to buy a platform, buy you as a platform, which means they can be very incentivized, or are they looking to buy you as a bolt-on, which means then there's going to be an opportunity of synergies. So it's really important to understand who the buyer is and what their contemplations are. I remember sitting, I think the former CEO of Quaker Steak and Lube is on the call, I think. But I was the interim CFO, and we were sitting there at the table as we were trying to sell the business. And the buyer said that this was Travel Centers of America. They said they wanted to get more four-wheel traffic into their travel centers. And they were putting in McDonald's and Burger Kings in trying to get more people, not, car traffic in. And my comment to him was, well, you know, people are not going to go out of the way to go to your truck stops to go to McDonald's, because there's McDonald's all over the place. I said, however, if you put a Quaker Steak and Lube in your truck stops, then that's going to draw you know, more traffic. And in that single meeting, we negotiated a pretty rich price for the company, and you know, really resolved the issues that Quaker Steak had been seeing. So it's really understand your buyer, understand what your buyer's exit strategy is. If you are trying to sell your business and you're one of those folks that are willing to maybe not sell it for as much because you want to provide stability to your workforce, if you sell it to somebody who has a history of flipping companies every 3 years, then that's going to run contrary to what you desire. Another aspect would be is if you are selling the majority of your the company, you're going to retain a minority interest. You need to understand what, again, the exit strategy is of the buyer, because if they never sell anything, that means your minority shareholder holdings is going to be worth virtually nothing, because you're never going to be able to monetize it. So it's very important to understand these things. So, and I've talked about you know, making sure you understand how you fit, how the buyer is looking at your company in terms of their own strategy. And then I think, as was mentioned previously, anticipate the buyer's questions before they ask them. It shows that you understand your business, that perhaps it's running well. You're going to help them feel more comfortable about you and your business, because they'll be feeling, again, the company's well run. And that's going to very likely add to the potential selling price through that. And then also, one of the things, and I think Wayne will be talking about this in a moment, but if you anticipate questions, if you through a preemptive quality of earnings review, have your skeletons all lined up, and you answer the issues, the concerns of the buyer before they come up, then you are able to describe the problems that you've had in the past on your own terms. So, and then the last thing, before I turn over to Wayne, the last thing is having answers also is going to add momentum to the sales price process. You know, the worst thing you want to do is have questions asked and then say, you know, you say, well, you know, I have to find out what the answer is, and I'm going to get back to you in a couple of days. That just slows down the momentum. This whole process of selling your business, you need to maintain momentum, maintain excitement, and maintain some level of competition to drive a higher price. And with that, I'm for the big finish. We're going to have Wayne jump in and cover the sales process.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for joining the call. Just a little bit about my background. I'm probably more of an operating guy. I've been doing selling and buying companies now for probably since the mid-90s. Initially with a strategic, I was with the Stanley Black & Decker company. At that time, it was known as Stanley Works. And we ended up acquiring a few companies under the business that I was running. And then beyond that, at Cleveland Motion Controls, did a number of transactions, some international. And then we sold that business to ITT. So I was a big part of preparing the company for sale to a large strategic buyer, and learned a lot about the preparations that both Brian and Mike talked about. You know, getting the data room ready. You know, and in the case of Cleveland Motion Controls, we started, you know, several years ahead of when we sold the company. So we were very well prepared for the kinds of questions that were going to be asked. Beyond that, I acquired a company called Midwest Precision in Eastlake, and that was an aerospace company. We were doing primarily aerospace parts manufacturing. Really nice business. Had built it up over about 8-9 years, and then sold that business to a PE firm that had an aerospace strategy. So it was kind of that, as John mentioned, you know, the lines are blurring between financial buyers and strategic buyers. And now we spun a company out of that Midwest called Kentronics, which is what I'm doing now. So looking at the chart here, I'm going to take these in a little bit different order. than what are listed. First thing I want to talk about is the deal structure. And again, I'm not an expert at, like many of you on the call are, but obviously from a seller standpoint, selling stock is preferred versus assets. But be prepared for the additional due diligence that the buyer is going to want to do in the case of a stock sale. It's all about risk. It's all about liabilities. What are the kinds of things that they may run into when they own the company? So you've got to be well prepared to answer those questions. And again, a lot of that has to do with getting your data together, getting your data room together, your documentation, in many cases, years ahead. Taking an earnout, another thing that's listed here. Never been a fan of this, but if that is the way the transaction is structured, my view on that from an operating viewpoint is, be as high up on the income statement as you can on an earnout, ideally tied to sales versus gross margin or EBITDA, because, you're not going to necessarily have control over the business once you sell it, or even if you're involved in a minority way, but sales is, easier to measure and potentially affect than some of those other things. Jumping up to the competitive aspect of the sale process, obviously having multiple parties, with serious interest is ideal. I hate to use the term auction, but that is the ideal approach. That way you've got multiple things that you can look at, and it's not just the price; it's what are they planning to do with the business, looking after your people and things like that. What we did in our most recent transaction is we tried to put a lot of the, I guess, more significant transaction factors into the LOI. And, that way, there was a lot of those things that were already negotiated at the time the LOI was agreed to. So it took away, I think, some of the things that might have come up down the road that might have derailed the transaction. And I found that to work very, very well for us. The calendar. So, you've all heard the expression, time is the enemy of all deals. And I think that that's something that is true. We had a really aggressive, but yet a detailed schedule of milestones, what due diligence was going to be done when management meetings were going to take place, all of those things were really nailed down into a schedule that was agreed to by both parties. And we both really worked hard to try to meet that schedule. And honestly, between LOI and close in the most recent transaction was about 3.5 months, roughly, which, was, I think, a pretty good time frame for that particular transaction. There was a lot of work to do, but we ended up accomplishing it and really met, for the most part, all those milestones that we had agreed to. And that sets expectations. Go ahead, John.
Not only is adherence to the calendar important once you got the LOI, is it not important prior to the LOI while you're in the sales process? Because if you adhere to the calendar, the sale calendar, the potential buyers are going to realize if they don't adhere to it, they're going to be dropped out. Someone else is going to buy the business. And alternatively, if you don't adhere to the calendar, then they're going to realize, they could just string you along if they want.
Sure. Yeah, I think, in the LOI, in our case, and I'm sure in many other cases, a close date or a close time frame is included in the LOI. So I think, that's agreed to up front. How long does the buyer think it's going to take for them to do what they need to do, as well as the seller to support it? And having that in the LOI is key. And again, in our most recent transaction, I think, the LOI had roughly a 75-day window. We were pretty close to that. And the reasons that it slid a little bit, had something to do with the holidays and things like that. So they weren't real significant issues that would have had an impact. So I'm going to jump to the top bullet, maintaining the business. And Brian talked a little bit about this, and I think so did Mike. This is hard to do when you're involved in running a business, particularly a growing business. It's and managing and in many cases being the point person with the buyer. It's really like 2 full-time jobs, and you need to be prepared for that. I've always worked hard, but these were 80 to 100-hour work weeks, because of all the things that needed to be done. But, you just got to be kind of committed to that because it's going to take a lot of work. Achieving the forecast. I think this was mentioned in a couple of other comments. You present a forecast, a budget to the buyer, and depending on how long due diligence and the whole sale process is, achieving those forecasts is really, really important. Having that credibility. So if as you're going on and you've got a quarter and another quarter rolls over and you've got your quarterly financials and you're at your forecast or beating it, that gives the buyer more confidence before they close. And it takes away from any further price discussions if we're able to do that. Minimize the distraction to employees. I think Brian talked about this a little bit. Rumors, you're right. Rumors go fast versus, facts. And so getting in front of that, I think is very, very important. Obviously, everybody's thinking about what's going to happen to them once this transaction occurs. And, it's hard for you as a seller to, commit to those things because it's not your business once you close. But, presenting the kind of the vision that the buyer has is important. And it's all about taking care of customers and keep focused on customers, because at the end of the day, that's what, that's what the buyer is buying, and that's what keeps everybody employed. I think in our case, we were very resistant on the buyer meeting our key managers until later in the process. And we set that expectation up front. And for us, it worked out well because I was leaving the business and they knew that. And so they were buying my management team. And I was very confident in my management team. I had no concerns about them doing well with the buyer. And it turned out that that was the case. But, we had a very high growth business. And so we really wanted to minimize the distraction that this process would have on, that growth. Momentum kind of gets into this whole credibility thing. So, if you've got a business and you're hitting your forecasts, one of the things that we did, being in aerospace and defense projects, is we would learn about we would be on certain key programs, aerospace programs or defense programs. And, as we learn more about the trajectory of those programs, how long they were going to last, what kind of volumes that they were going to, be in the future, we really promoted that and communicated, the customer information to the buyer. I think that really helped to affirm their view on what the future is going to be, because they're buying those future cash flows. So if they know and have confidence that, once the close is done, that the business, the trajectory is going to be what we say it is, or even better, again, it takes away from, well, gee, we'd like to change our purchase price. So it really takes away from that. One of the things that we did, we had a business that had, a fair amount of capital investment, machine tools and things like that. These are things that take a while to get and they're expensive. But in our case, adding that capacity was going to really help, achieve the growth that we were projecting. So we were able to get the buyer to, we would actually purchase CapEx, and the buyer agreed to pay for it, at closing. So this was beyond the purchase price. And the reason for that, I think, and it worked out for them, we were able to get the CapEx, the equipment procured. Again, it takes time to get some of that equipment. And the buyer was going to be able to get the benefit of that equipment sooner rather than later. And they bought into that. And, it worked out very well. I think it was probably close to $1 million worth of things that we acquired for the business that the buyer paid us for above and beyond the purchase price. So, that's something to consider also. So those are my points for my part of this.
Thank you, Wayne. We're at, I'm going to turn this over. Let me stop sharing my screen and turn this back over to Eric. Are there, do we go into the networking, or what's our next steps?
Well, we do have some questions if you gentlemen have a little bit of time.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So Buck Rogers asked, specifically to the extent that the owner is the business, and in our industry we call that owner-centric, right, Mike? Is that a value detractor during the time of the sale? Surely there can be a transition plan, but at some point that person will not be in the picture going forward.
Yes, absolutely a value detractor. Probably the number one value detractor is the involvement of the owner. And if that's too significant, again, if the owner is the business, we say there is no business.
I think
I'll just add,
Part of the preparedness then is, and if you start early enough in that cycle, is building out that management team around you, whether it's elevating people within the organization or bringing in talent from outside the organization and making sure that you train the individuals. There has to be a good training program in place as well.
Yeah, you want to do that ahead of time, because if it's done just before the transition, it looks like window dressing and people will see through that. So you need to make sure you've built up that management team substantially ahead, that they've got time to have a record of success as well. And
Right.
Yeah, I've said to owners that, again, as Mike said, prepare years ahead. But if you can show to a buyer that you as the owner are basically superfluous, that's going to add value.
And they're going to, a buyer is going to really test that and really look for those signals that are subtle, whether the owner, how involved the owner really is, or the lead person, the CEO. And so having that management team is critical. And like I think everybody said, that doesn't start, a month before, you start having conversations with buyers. It needs to start years ahead.
Thank you. Greg Waynia, and if I murdered your name, I apologize, Greg, has a question for Wayne. Wayne, how important was the investment banker in taking you through the transaction, and who was that investment banker?
Investment banker was Paramax in Western New York. They were very heavily involved in the preparations of the the confidential information memorandum. They participated in management meetings. But I would say that they really stepped out of the way. Once the LOI was agreed, they really stepped out of the way between us as sellers and the buyer in the whole due diligence process. So they really were not that involved. And I think that, it worked out okay for us, not having them in the middle there, going through. And the due diligence was very, very extensive. Again, it was a stock deal, and it was, again, a deep dive on liabilities. I mean, and growth. So a stock deal, you're buying those potential skeletons, and in our case, this particular buyer was very, very thorough on their due diligence.
Yeah, we used William Blair, and I would say that as far as knowing the business, it's up to the management team and the owner to really know the business. But frankly, they managed the whole sale process and connected us to the buyers. They were really kind of vital for us, because they were able to tailor our presentation to, we were concerned that we'd end up selling to a strategic, and we wanted to be able to be sold as a platform so we could continue on for the management team. And they were really good at connecting us to the right group of prospective buyers. So that's their value. You want to find somebody like William Blair had people that were specialized in packaging. We had recycling, so they had somebody that were kind of in specialty materials. And they were also, we had packaging equipment, so they had some people that were familiar with that part of the business as well. So, you want to do your own due diligence on the investment bank to make sure that they have the skill set that complements what you do, and that the culture matches. If you're a steel-toed shoe and they're all suits and out of New York City, that may not fit your culture. You just want to make sure that there's a good cultural match and that they've got the experience to understand your business.
And isn't it also true that it's great to have someone in between leading up to the LOI? It's almost like the general manager of the car dealership, that you're not on the front line. You're able to say, well, I don't know if we could do that, but let me see. It gives you a couple bites of the apple in the negotiation. It's always good to have a third party. Generally, it's good to have a third party in that.
Good sounding board sometimes too.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Hey, Wayne, we have another question for you and for the rest of the panel. Greg Jen wants to know, have you used insurance in lieu of escrow and in contractual language for the buyer? And how, if so, how large were those deals?
No, have not. I think for every transaction I was involved with, I think that I can think of quickly. Obviously there was escrow. As a seller, you want to minimize the escrow. I think in the last deal was about 10%, so it wasn't too bad. It was a fairly short-term escrow. It was about, I want to say it's 15 months or a year and a half or something like that. We had an escrow on working capital, which was taken care of after about 90 days. But no, we did not use insurance at all. And unfortunately, and I think in all my transactions, both on the sell side and the buy side, we were able to on the sell side recover the full escrow.
Yeah, we
and,
had.
and I'll tell you guys, you're getting back to the whole thing about how you run the business and how you're prepared. To be able to say, there was no holdback on escrow, I think just says something about how you run the business. And so if you get all the skeletons out of the way and they're all clear, there's less risk that there's going to be an escrow claim.
Yeah, in our case, the buyer used reps and warranties insurance, and they
Sure.
really didn't. There were some networking capital adjustments and things like that, but there was a period on the reps and warranties, but they really didn't have an escrow or a holdback on the transaction. But they bridged that gap with reps and warranties, and I think that's for larger transactions. That's more typical now. From what
And I think on a stock sale it is too. You're going to have a much more extensive reps and warranties. Our contract was very, very extensive and it covered everything, any type of human resource, employment benefits, environmental, tax, you name it, was all there.
Right.
Lastly, Mike, you had mentioned cyber attacks. Peter Cravrell says, given the accelerating rate of the cyber attacks on businesses of all size, what role does cybersecurity play in a company's valuation, and how do you know you're not buying a ticking time bomb?
I'll tackle the last part first. And a ticking time bomb thing is that's really the importance of bringing in cybersecurity professionals and doing that due diligence as the buyer, and having somebody on your team of advisors that has expertise in cybersecurity. And what was the first part of that question, Eric?
What role does cybersecurity play in a company's valuation?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it depends how intensive the cybersecurity of that particular business is. So if it's a e-commerce business, maybe, for example, there's much more information and due diligence that is needed, whereas a business that the cyber isn't as significant, it's not as important to the valuation. But certainly it's one of the factors as we talk about the detractors and drivers of value, that also, like most of these, really can go either way. It could add to the value or it could take away from the value. And I think part of that then is the IT team that you have in place at the company, and maybe Wayne or Brian could touch on that. But the team that you have, if it's just kind of a break fix IT guy and you have a relatively complex structure, maybe you have a lot of exposure in terms of cyber.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in, Mike. Thanks for the question. So cyber, obviously, very recently has become a much bigger and more highly visible situation with the Colonial Pipeline situation. In our business, we were doing defense work, and a lot of the and I would think that in many businesses, a lot of the customers are auditing cyber. What have you done in your business to lower that risk? Because customers are affected. So customers, and we had customers that actually required us to do a full audit of ourselves and actually score it. And, we had to show that we were improving our score, every 6 months or every year. And so, in our case, maybe a little bit unique because of that, but I think a lot of customers now are requiring it. And cyber is more about, from my experience, I'm not an IT expert, but cyber is a lot about procedures, policies, and how employees behave than it is sometimes about the technology.
Yeah, for us, it wasn't, we didn't have the same constraints that Wayne did or same concerns that Wayne did, but I know that it's an area that post-acquisition has really been given much more attention, and and it's probably, even though we had just recently done an ERP implementation, it's an area where we could have invested in more staff probably to handle it. So it's just more of a concern these days.
And I think it goes
there's
back
insurance
to,
available too for that.
I think
As
it
you
goes
all
back
know, I'm
to
sure.
being prepared and anticipating questions. If you have a strong sense that cybersecurity is a key issue in your business, then you probably should have that audit done prior to even commencing the sale process, and then make it available in the data room to to the buyers. And so when they say, well, what about this? You say, oh, we have that information. We've already covered it. Again, just anticipate the questions before they come in.
Yeah.
Voice.
Well, John and Wayne and Mike and Brian, we really appreciate your time and your expertise. And I will circulate your presentation, John, to everyone who attended at the conclusion of this. Any last words of wisdom, John, before we close this out and go on to networking?
I think we've covered a lot of it. Maybe we do a round robin of the group. I think it's just, there are limitations to how much you can impact your value, but you can. The sooner you start trying to prepare for the sale and get things teed up, and the more organized you are in the process, the more competition you can create within the sale. All of these things are going to drive up value. And then most of what we've been talking about here is selling your business. Certainly, if you're looking to buy a business, I think you could use all of these things that we talked about today as opportunities to push value down. That if you see certain things that are on the mind map that exist, you could say, well, wait, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. And that could give you some leverage to knock the price down. So it works both ways. Wayne, do you want any wrap up?
Yeah, I think, just echoing what's been said, preparedness is key. Start the process early. And when I say early, I don't mean a few months. Operate your business as if you're planning to sell it. And with that mindset, there's just the things that you do, the documentation you create, the data that you make easily accessible, all just becomes a lot easier when that time comes.
Thanks. Mike?
Yeah.
Mike, you want to run and we'll finish up with Brian?
Yeah, I think one of the things to keep in mind that historical transition rates are not good. So 70 to 80% of the businesses that are put on the market do not sell. Only 30% of businesses make it to second generation, 12% to the third, and 3% to the fourth generation. And so all these things we talked about today, they're really crucial, and it's about exit readiness. And again, not just the business itself, but the owner has to be ready for the transition as well and figure out what he's going to do personally after. So it's aligning the business, the personal, and the financial goals.
Thanks, Mike. Brian, can you finish it up?
Yeah, I would reiterate the preparedness issue, and that, for us, it took about 1.5 years through the whole process that prepare and actually go through the courting of the potential buyers. But the other thing that I would tell you is that you're dealing typically with sophisticated parties that are looking to invest or to buy. So you got to make sure that everything hangs together and what you're telling people is truthful, because if you're trying to peddle something that's a little bit of a fabrication, everybody will see through that. So, you know, you're better being straight throughout the whole process, because, you know, nothing's going to squeak by. So, you know, make sure you're ready and make sure you're giving the clearest portrayal of the business possible.
Gentlemen, have a fantastic weekend. Thank you again for your time. All right, everybody.